The streets were alive with chaos. Grayson's boots hit the cracked pavement with a steady rhythm, drowning out the shrill echoes of sirens and the distant thud of explosions. His heart pounded not from fear, but from the knowledge that the woman he was racing to save was running out of time. The sound of a nearby building crumbling sent a tremor through the ground, but he didn't pause. He couldn't. She's still alive. She has to be. He rounded a corner, nearly colliding with a group of panicked civilians, their faces twisted in terror. They scattered, scrambling to avoid the ruins of the war-torn city, but Grayson didn't flinch. Not now. Ahead, through the haze of smoke and debris, he saw her, Celia. She was crouched low, her back against the wall, eyes scanning the horizon. He felt his chest tighten at the sight of her, an odd mix of fear and admiration. She was not just an alien. She was a force, a being whose presence could level cities and whose power could break the world in ways he didn't fully understand. But right now, she was just a woman. A woman who needed saving. Grayson's fingers brushed the hilt of his pulse rifle, readying for another fight, but it wasn't the weapon he focused on now, it was her. Her pale skin seemed to glow against the smoldering landscape, her long silver hair fluttering like a banner in the wind. And those eyes, violet, the color of a storm-racked sky, locked onto his, and for a moment, everything else faded. "You shouldn't have come for me," she said, her voice low but firm, not giving the relief he was hoping for. Grayson knelt before her, his hand hovering over her injured shoulder. "I wasn't going to leave you here, Celia." Her gaze softened, but only briefly. "The warlord will kill you. You know that." His mouth tightened into a grim line. "I'm not leaving you." She hesitated, clearly trying to assess the truth of his words. They had met only a few days ago, thrown together by fate, or perhaps something darker, but he knew this woman. She was as strong as she was vulnerable, a paradox of power wrapped in fragility. She had saved his life more times than he could count, but now the tables had turned. Celia closed her eyes for a moment, shaking her head slightly as if trying to dispel a fleeting thought. Then, without warning, she collapsed into his arms, her breast shallow, her body trembling. Grayson gritted his teeth. No time for this. He hoisted her up, careful not to jostle her wounded side, and ran. The sounds of pursuit, heavy boots, clanging weapons, were close. Very close. He didn't need to look back to know they were coming for her, coming for them both. And in his heart, a small but steady pulse of panic began to drum against his chest. The ruins of the city stretched ahead, an endless expanse of destruction. And there, amidst the chaos, he saw it, their only chance. A forgotten bunker, half sunken into the earth, its entrance barely visible under layers of rubble. "We're getting out of here," he muttered, determination rising in his chest. Celia's fingers tightened around his arm. "They'll find us," she whispered, her voice thick with doubt. "And when they do, there will be no escape. Then we make sure they don't," Grayson said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. They reached the bunker's entrance just as another explosion rattled the ground. Dust and debris fell like a blanket, but Grayson shoved the metal door open, dragging Celia inside. The cool air inside was a welcome relief, but he didn't allow himself to relax. He couldn't afford to. Celia sank against the wall, her eyes closing in exhaustion, but Grayson remained standing, his pulse still racing. The room was sparse, cold concrete walls and rusted equipment littered in the shadows, the air thick with the smell of decay. He looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of their situation. "We need to get to the extraction point. If we don't—" "I know," Celia interrupted softly, her eyes opening to meet his. There was a sadness in her gaze, an acceptance of their reality. "But even if we get there, they'll follow." He clenched his fists, frustration building. "We'll fight. We'll survive." Her gaze flickered to his, a brief flash of something, fear, before she spoke again. "You're not the only one at risk here, Grayson. They'll destroy everything to get to me." The weight of her words sank in, and for a moment, he let the silence stretch between them. Her safety was no longer just a matter of survival, it was a matter of choice. She had become something more to him than he'd ever anticipated. A soft click of the door behind them made his spine stiffen. Grayson spun, pulse rifle raised, but the figure standing there made him hesitate. A woman in full combat gear, dark, sleek, and alien in her demeanor, stepped into the room. Her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the soft light of the bunker. She was not alone. "You've failed," the woman said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think you can run? The warlord is on his way. You've no place to hide." Grayson's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know this woman, but she knew him. His grip tightened around his rifle. "I'll die before I let you take her." The woman's lips curled into a knowing smile, her gaze flickering to Celia, who was now standing, her body poised like a predator ready to strike. "You won't get that chance," she replied, stepping forward. Grayson felt the floor beneath his feet shift, and suddenly, the room seemed smaller, the walls closing in on them. Celia stepped in front of him, her presence like an unspoken promise. "Then we fight." And as the woman's grin stretched wider, the first pulse of a weapon whined in the distance. Grayson braced himself, his resolve firm. They were no longer just running. They were fighting. The bunker's door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing them inside. Grayson's pulse raced as he turned toward Celia, his eyes scanning for any signs of injury beyond the superficial wound she had sustained. But there was no time for reassurances, no time for the quiet relief he longed for. Their situation had worsened. The strange woman, the one who had appeared out of nowhere, stood with a grim smile on her face. Her dark combat gear blended into the shadows, her posture radiating an air of confidence, as though she were certain of her victory. Her voice had a chilling calm to it as she stepped deeper into the room. "You think you can run?" she said again, her eyes glinting with unspoken threats. "You've sealed your fate." Grayson's fingers tightened around the grip of his rifle. He kept his gaze fixed on the woman, but out of the corner of his eye, he watched Celia. She was staring at the ground, her expression unreadable, as though the impending danger was only another annoyance to her. But Grayson knew better. There was more to her than anyone realized. "How did you find us?" Grayson demanded, his voice low but steady. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze flicked from Grayson to Celia and then back again. "I didn't need to find you," she said, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. "You were never meant to hide. You were meant to be caught." Celia lifted her head, her violet eyes locking onto the woman's. "You're with him," she said softly, her voice thick with contempt. "The warlord." The woman's smile deepened, confirming Celia's suspicion. "Of course. Who else would send a team of assassins after the great Celia? You may be a traitor, but your blood is valuable." Grayson's chest tightened at the mention of traitor. His gaze darted to Celia, but her face remained impassive. She wasn't giving anything away, not to him, not to the woman. "Don't talk to her like that," Grayson said sharply, stepping in front of Celia. "She's not your enemy." The woman chuckled, a cruel, sharp sound that scraped against the walls. "Oh, but she is. She is the reason this war started. And she'll be the one who ends it." Celia's face tightened, her posture stiffening, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the gap between her and the woman. Grayson instinctively reached out to stop her, but she shook her head, silencing him with a single gesture. "I didn't choose this," Celia said, her voice steady but edged with something deeper, something Grayson couldn't quite place. "I didn't choose the war, the bloodshed. But I will end it." The woman laughed again, a sound tinged with pity. "End it? You're just a weapon, Celia. Nothing more. You'll destroy this world just like the others you've left behind." Grayson's heart beat faster. There was so much more to Celia than even he knew. Her history, her past, it was tangled in lies and half-truths, but he could feel it, in the way she carried herself, in the weight of her silence. This woman before them, she was playing a game, a dangerous one, and Grayson was caught in the middle. But for all his training, all his preparation, he wasn't ready for this. We don't have time for this, Grayson said, his voice laced with urgency. We need to move. If the warlord's already on his way, I won't let you take her. The woman's tone was cold, unyielding, her eyes flashing with murderous intent. Before Grayson could react, the woman lunged. But Celia was faster. In one swift motion, Celia's hand shot out, and the woman was thrown back with an invisible force, crashing into the concrete wall behind her. Grayson barely had time to register what had just happened before Celia turned to him, her eyes wide and fierce. Go. Now. Grayson didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the bunker where the emergency escape tunnels were located. He didn't have a plan, didn't have a clue about how to get out of this mess, but he knew one thing: they couldn't stay there. The woman recovered quickly, her face twisted in fury. You think you can escape me? She shouted. You've made your choice. Grayson led Celia down the dark, narrow tunnel, his hand gripping hers tightly as they ran. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of old stone and decay. The further they went, the deeper they descended, and Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading towards something far worse than what they had left behind. Where are we going? Celia asked breathlessly, her voice filled with a mix of defiance and uncertainty. Grayson didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. They didn't have time to make decisions. The warlord was coming. He had no doubt of that. I don't know, he said honestly, his voice strained. But we'll figure it out. They moved in silence, the only sound the echo of their footsteps against the stone. Grayson's mind raced, his thoughts flicking to the warlord. To the woman who had attacked them. To Celia, this woman who had become both his ally and the object of an unspoken longing he couldn't explain. What was she to him? A soldier? A partner? Something more? He glanced at her, his breath catching in his throat. The fear in her eyes wasn't just about the warlord. It was something deeper. Something buried beneath the surface. Grayson could feel it, a secret she wasn't ready to share. Celia noticed his gaze and turned away, her jaw tightening. Don't look at me like that, she muttered. Grayson didn't know what to say. He didn't know what she meant. All he knew was that he couldn't stop himself from caring about her, from wanting to protect her. But he couldn't protect her from everything. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind them. A sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, close. They weren't alone anymore. Grayson spun around, rifle raised, but the tunnel was empty. He could feel the threat closing in. Move, he said urgently. We don't have time. They ran faster, the walls of the tunnel narrowing, the passage more treacherous as they went. And through it all, Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that they were running straight into the heart of danger. The tunnel twisted, a serpentine path leading them deeper into the mountain. The air was thin, dry, and the walls felt too close, as if the earth itself were pressing in around them. Grayson could hear the soft shuffle of Celia's boots behind him, her breaths coming faster as they pushed forward. Her silence felt heavy, the weight of her thoughts pressing against the very air they shared. He had seen that look in her eyes before, the one that spoke of unspoken things, of burdens too heavy for even the strongest shoulders. The faint hum of their footsteps was the only sound in the dark. The further they went, the more the silence seemed to stretch, an unbroken line of tension between them. Grayson glanced back at her. She was different now, closed off, withdrawn. Not the Celia he'd fought alongside, not the one who had always been so sure, so unyielding in battle. This Celia was quieter, more vulnerable, as if some part of her had cracked. Celia, he said softly, his voice breaking the silence like a single drop into an otherwise still pond. What did she mean? About you being a traitor? The word stung as it left his mouth, but he needed to know. They had no time to dance around it anymore. Her pace slowed for a fraction of a second, her face shadowed, lips pressed into a thin line. But she didn't stop. You heard her, Celia replied, her voice colder now, laced with a hint of regret. It's true. Grayson's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't stop. True? What the hell do you mean? I didn't have a choice, she said quickly, as if the words were an afterthought, something she had rehearsed over and over in her mind. I was born into this war. I didn't pick it. And I didn't pick sides. She exhaled sharply, as if the words had been weighing down on her for far too long. You don't make sense, Grayson muttered, frustration boiling just beneath the surface. He turned to face her now, the dim light from his flashlight catching the edge of her face. Her eyes, however, remained hidden in shadow. You say you didn't pick sides, but you're fighting for one now. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she hesitated, as though weighing the consequences of her words. You don't understand. She looked away from him, her gaze now fixed on the narrowing tunnel ahead, but her voice softened. No one does. Grayson felt something deep in his chest stir. This was more than just the war. It wasn't just about who was right and who was wrong. There was something far more personal here, something she had been running from, something buried beneath the surface. He could see it now, in the tightness of her shoulders, in the way she held herself. Celia wasn't just a soldier. She wasn't just a weapon. She was someone who had been torn apart by circumstances beyond her control. And yet here she was, fighting for something, even if she didn't quite understand it herself. Without thinking, Grayson reached out and placed a hand on her arm, gently turning her back to face him. Tell me. I can't help you if you keep hiding from me. She froze at his touch, a brief flicker of tension shooting through her body before she relaxed, allowing him to turn her. Celia's eyes met his, briefly, and then she quickly glanced away, her lips parted, but no words came. We don't have time for this, Grayson said, but his tone was softer now, more understanding. I don't know what you're running from, but I can help you. You don't have to do this alone. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the sound of her breathing mixing with the distant hum of the earth. Then, slowly, Celia looked back at him, her eyes darker than before, haunted. I was part of something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if admitting this out loud would make it all too real. Something they created. A weapon. I never chose to be it, but I was born into it. Trained for it. Used for it. Her words came faster now, spilling out like secrets she could no longer hold inside. The warlord, the one who sent that woman after us, he knew what I could do. He knows what I am. And he wanted me to become his tool. Grayson felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words pressing down on him. The woman he had trusted, fought alongside, had been shaped by forces beyond her control. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a game she never asked to play. And you escaped? Grayson asked, disbelief in his voice. How could anyone escape from something like that? Celia nodded once, sharply. I ran. I found a way out. But I left behind a trail. They've been hunting me ever since. Grayson's mind whirled with the implications. She had been a weapon. A created weapon. And now she was here, running from it, running from herself. Running from the very thing she had been forced to become. But something else nagged at him, something he couldn't shake. If you left, then why are you still fighting? He asked, his voice softer, more curious now. Why not just disappear? I can't, she said firmly, her eyes flashing with a mixture of determination and pain. I can't run forever. But I can stop it. Stop him. The warlord is the reason it all started. And I'm the reason it will end. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any weapon. Grayson's mind raced, piecing together what she had just said. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was trying to fix something. Something she had been a part of, but never truly wanted. Her gaze softened then, and for the first time, Grayson saw the cracks in her hardened exterior. I didn't want to be what they made me. But now, I have to make it right. Before he could respond, the distant rumble of footsteps reached them. Not far behind. Grayson's heart stopped. We're not alone, he whispered urgently. Get ready. Celia nodded, her body shifting into combat mode with a grace he couldn't help but admire. But there was no time to admire anything. They needed to move, now. Grayson pulled her into a quick run, both of them heading toward the unknown, the future uncertain. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just about surviving anymore. They were going to end this, or they were going to die trying. And in the end, Grayson wasn't sure which outcome he feared more. Grayson could feel the vibrations through the ground long before the figures came into view. Each step was like a hammer striking stone, each footfall resonating through the tunnel walls. The noise grew louder, sharper, until it reverberated in his skull. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Celia's. Her face was set, every muscle tense as if she were bracing for the inevitable. She had come to him, entrusted him with the truth. And now, they were both on the edge of something neither one of them could control. "We don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath, her voice a low rasp that matched the urgency in her movements. She gripped her weapon tightly, her knuckles white against the blackened metal of her blade. Grayson didn't need to ask what she meant. The footsteps were getting closer. The enemy was upon them. But it wasn't just the threat of physical danger that haunted him. It was the weight of her words, the revelation that she was a weapon. A pawn in someone else's game. She had carried that burden for so long, and now, it was his turn to bear it with her. "Stay sharp," Grayson said, his voice clipped, his hand resting on the hilt of his own blade. The weapon was a comfort, but only for a moment. He wasn't sure if anything could truly prepare him for what was coming. "We'll take them out, but we need to move quickly. No mistakes." Celia nodded, but her gaze had already shifted toward the end of the tunnel, where shadows danced and writhed. She was already seeing the enemy, even if they hadn't fully emerged yet. The instinct to fight, to protect, to survive, it was so deeply ingrained in her that Grayson knew it would be impossible to stop her. But he couldn't help but wonder, what if it was too late? What if there was no escaping the past? A flicker of movement caught his attention, the glint of metal reflecting off the dim light. He tensed, instinctively stepping in front of Celia, his body a shield. The footsteps were louder now, growing in strength. The first soldier emerged from the shadows, and then another. There were 4 of them in total, well-armed, battle-hardened. The sight of them sent a chill through Grayson's spine. He recognized their insignia instantly. These weren't random mercenaries. These were soldiers of the warlord's personal guard. Celia inhaled sharply behind him, her breath steady but quick. Grayson could feel her tension mounting like a rising storm. "Stay back," he warned, his tone low but firm. The last thing he wanted was for her to rush in and take unnecessary risks. But she was already moving. There was no hesitation in her step, no doubt in her eyes. She was a soldier first, and whatever else she had been, whatever she had become, the fight still called to her. The soldiers were closing in. Grayson's heart hammered in his chest. He stepped forward, raising his blade, but Celia was already beside him, her own weapon drawn. They moved in tandem, fluid, synchronized. The first soldier swung his weapon toward Grayson's chest, but he deflected the blow with ease, his body shifting into a smooth counter. The second soldier aimed for Celia, but she was faster, ducking under his strike and landing a blow to his ribs. He gasped, his body crumpling to the floor. Grayson's eyes narrowed as he saw the third soldier, a towering figure with a long spear, coming toward him. But before the soldier could react, Celia was there, her blade flashing in the dim light. The soldier's spear went wide, and Grayson took the opportunity to land a brutal strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor. The final soldier was retreating, eyes wide with panic. Grayson stepped forward, his blade raised high, but a sharp cry from Celia stopped him. "Don't kill him," she ordered, her voice harsh. "We need him alive." Grayson's gaze flickered between the soldier and Celia. His hand tightened on the hilt of his weapon, but he nodded, stepping back. The soldier didn't need any more encouragement. He dropped his weapon, his hands raised in surrender. Grayson's blade hovered just inches from his neck, but he didn't strike. Not yet. Celia approached the soldier, her movements purposeful. "Who sent you?" she demanded, her voice cold, emotionless. The soldier trembled, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Celia's gaze hardened. Speak! Now! Warlord sent us, the soldier stammered, his voice cracking with fear. He knows about her. He jerked a thumb towards Celia, his eyes widening as he realized his mistake. He's been hunting her. Grayson's blood ran cold. The warlord had known about her all along. This wasn't just some coincidence. This was personal. And what does he want? Grayson asked, his voice low, edged with growing fury. The soldier swallowed hard, his eyes darting between them. He wants her back. He wants the weapon. And if he can have her. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Celia's expression remained unreadable. She stepped closer to the soldier, her gaze piercing. Where is he? The soldier hesitated, but it was a brief moment. His gaze shifted, his eyes darting to the shadows behind them. He was stalling. Grayson felt it, the unease, the fear, the desperation to survive. The soldier opened his mouth to speak, but before the words could leave his lips, a deafening explosion shook the tunnel. The ground beneath them trembled, and dust cascaded from the walls like a flood. Celia instinctively dropped to the ground, rolling behind Grayson as he braced himself against the shockwave. A distant roar echoed through the tunnel, deep, guttural, unnatural. And then, everything went silent. Grayson's mind raced, but he didn't have time to process it. The soldier was gone, vanishing into the shadows, slipping away in the chaos. Damn it! Grayson cursed, his eyes scanning the now dusty tunnel for any sign of movement. Where the hell is he? Celia stood up, her hand grabbing his arm. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of dread and realization. It's him, she whispered. The warlord had come. And this time, there would be no running.